I used to believe in fairy tales, not the silly ones with glass slippers or talking animals, but the quiet, profound ones, the ones where love, built on mutual respect and shared dreams, conquers external pressures and familial expectations. I truly thought Daniel and I were one of those stories. He was the golden heir, burdened by an impossible name, and I was the brilliant, if unconventional, girl he met studying abroad, a girl with her own quiet wealth and ferocious intellect. But the crushing, decades-old weight of his family's expectations quickly crushed the spontaneity and integrity right out of him. Marriage to a thorn, I discovered, is not a union of equals, it's a strategic, silent acquisition, a contract for silence, and I was the chattel, the least valued asset to be dismissed, minimized, and publicly ignored. For 5 long, suffocating years, I lived a daily, agonizing lie. I was nothing more than a permanent houseguest, a mistake Daniel's mother regretted with every cold, calculated breath she took. Every shared meal was a performance of my inadequacy, every moment of silence a confirmation of my nullity. The Thorn name, the immense, inherited wealth, and the generations of cold, calculating power were built on exploiting opportunity and dismissing humanity. I was the dull, inexpensive wallpaper they were constantly planning to tear down, an unnecessary expense to be discarded when the proper heir arrived. My clothes were designated simple but interpreted as cheap, my opinions were trivial but deemed foolish. My very existence required me to maintain a constant, unnatural silence. And Daniel, my husband, the man who supposedly loved me and saw my worth, was the most eloquent, most damaging silence of all. His complicity was louder and more painful than any of their overt insults. His utter indifference was a deeper, more permanent cut than his mother's controlled, surgical rage. I remember the first year with crystalline clarity because I truly tried to salvage the dream. I spent 2 full, exhausting days preparing Daniel's favorite meal, a complicated, multi-course French recipe he'd loved when we were simple, hopeful students, an attempt to inject genuine warmth into that magnificent, suffocating mausoleum of a mansion. But Mrs. Thorne, the grand matriarch, inspected it as if it were contaminated waste. She picked up a fork, waved it dismissively, sniffed the air, and set the fork back down, her nostrils flaring in disgust. Too much garlic, Elena. Thorne men have sensitive palates. Stick to managing the linen closet, dear, she stated. She never granted it the dignity of a taste, her judgment was predetermined, final, based solely on who I was. And Daniel, my protector, just picked at it, offered a weak shrug, and said, "It's fine, mother." She tried. Tried. That single word was the highest, most condescending compliment I ever received, the pitying, patronizing acknowledgement that I, the nobody, the amateur, tried. Every time he uttered it, he cemented my position as the inept outsider. His silence, his failure to defend me, was the worst betrayal. I could have handled Aunt Carol's theatrical disdain and her petty, incessant criticisms. I could have ignored Mrs. Thorne's icy glares which seemed to actively freeze the very air in the room, making it thin and difficult to breathe. But Daniel, every single, inexcusable time he allowed their cruelty to stand, every moment he chose cowardice over partnership, he signed off on my complete humiliation. He was actively choosing his inheritance, his social status, and his mother's perverse approval, over the woman he had promised to cherish and the fundamental integrity of our vows, choosing material comfort over commitment to me. I started keeping a journal in those years, not of my personal pain, but a systematic, clinical record of their transgressions, cataloging every slight, every sneer, every piece of passive aggression as a quantifiable debt. I knew, with certainty, that the interest, when it came due, would be steep, merciless, and ultimately, absolute. I noted when Aunt Carol laughed openly when I casually mentioned an investment idea regarding global logistics software, only for the market to prove me right 1,000 times over 6 months later, cementing my secret genius and their very public financial idiocy. I chronicled the public humiliation on Christmas Eve when Mrs. Thorne accidentally bought me a cheap, nylon housekeeper's apron as a gift, telling me it was time to embrace my true domestic calling since clearly I lacked the intellect and breeding for anything more. That initial, slow-burning rage wasn't purely for revenge, it was a desperate, visceral survival mechanism, a profound need to prove to myself that I was more than the contemptible air they pretended not to breathe. My 5th anniversary. That single night was the absolute, unyielding point of no return. I sat alone, hours past midnight, with a small, personally baked cake, the only beacon of warmth in that magnificent, indifferent dining hall. I desperately told myself his silence was just corporate exhaustion, not the deep, cold pit of indifference. Then Aunt Carol walked in, seeing only a failure to bear an air. And then Daniel walked in, exhausted, irritable, glanced at the cake and at me, offered a weary, dismissive nod that held no recognition, and went straight upstairs, utterly dismissing the entirety of the 5 years we had shared. No touch, no word, just, nothing. He didn't forget the date, he simply didn't care enough to prioritize its significance over his exhaustion or his mother's expectations. I didn't cry. I just quietly blew out the candles, and in that precise moment, the meek Elena died an instantaneous, silent death. The hopeful wife instantly evaporated, and a cold, calculating, corporate executive took her place, a woman driven purely by strategy, asset accumulation, and the need for absolute, surgical justice. The only wish I made tonight, I whispered to the empty, echoing room, was for strength. The strength to stop needing him to see me. I knew then that the only way to earn their respect was not through love, which they clearly didn't comprehend, but through power, which they recognized, bowed to, and worshipped above all else. What they didn't know, what they could never have possibly conceived in their antiquated, privileged minds, was that I wasn't running trivial errands when I left that house every day. I was running an empire, an entire parallel economy. I didn't just inherit seed money, I inherited a technological vision from my father, an eccentric genius who shielded his fortune and his inventions from public view. When I founded Aegis Tech, it was a ghost company, masked by layers of impenetrable offshore accounts, corporate veils, and non-disclosure agreements that would have choked their highest-paid legal team. We built our foundation on quantum AI integration, a technology so advanced, so disruptive, it rendered their Thorn Corporation's traditional, archaic financial models obsolete literally before they were fully implemented. While the Thorns were focused on securing depreciating real estate portfolios and investing in outdated bonds and legacy manufacturing, we were dealing in real-time predictive analytics, controlling over 70% of the global cross-platform microtransaction market, a sector they didn't even recognize as a threat. We didn't compete, we dictated the market. My proprietary software, coded in late-night sessions fueled by cold coffee and pure spite, knew precisely where every single one of Thorn's investments would fail weeks before their senior executives had even finished preparing their quarterly board reports. My double life required meticulous, punishing discipline, an iron will to play the daily role of the fool, the domestic accessory. At the mansion, I was Elena, the meek wife, easily dismissed, easily ignored, wearing deliberately simple fabrics. At Aegis Tech, I was Madam CEO, sharp, ruthless, dressed in tailored silence that commanded attention, surrounded by brilliant engineers who treated my every word as the unquestionable directive. Mr. Lee, my COO, a veteran of Silicon Valley, was my only confidant, and he watched my domestic degradation with controlled fury, but he understood the necessary brutality of the game. The ethical dilemma became a daily, internal torment. I held the exact, precise solution to the Thorn Corporation's slow, agonizing death right there in my briefcase, a data chip that could have reversed their fortunes. The thought constantly whispered, should I tell him? Should I save the man I married, despite his relentless cowardice? I could have ended their misery with a single, anonymous phone call or a secret capital injection. But every time I reached for that moral high ground, I remembered Mrs. Thorn's clinical, cold-blooded cruelty when discussing my inability to conceive. The Thorn bloodline is strong, Elena. Perhaps the fault lies with you for lacking the vision to produce an heir, treating a private, deeply personal heartache as nothing more than a public business failure, and Daniel, standing right there, simply looking at his expensive Italian shoes, offering nothing. That's when the final verdict was delivered. The indifference outweighed the love and the moral imperative. The man I loved was gone, spiritually replaced by a spineless puppet of his lineage, a coward who valued his mother's poisonous approval over my entire existence and my heart. The secret ceased being a shield, it transformed into a calculated, strategic weapon, loaded and ready to fire. I wasn't waiting for them to simply apologize, I was orchestrating the circumstances for them to beg, to prostrate themselves before the only power in the city capable of saving them. I would make absolutely certain they knew, to the deepest core of their snobbish souls, exactly who they were begging. The cracks in the Thorn foundation became gaping, undeniable fissures. Daniel's desperation was pitiful. He was trapped, utterly paralyzed, between his mother's outdated, suffocating pride and the company's inevitable financial ruin. He was frantically trying to secure a pivotal merger with the Chen family, but the Chen family, being savvy, generational operators, were already making discreet, highly profitable overtures to Aegis, recognizing the seismic shift in global power before the Thorns even registered the earthquake. Daniel would come home late, his face etched with failure, smelling of stale corporate air, and he would pace the floor of our silent bedroom, muttering about aggressive new tech firms that were playing dirty and using unethical market tactics to steal their contracts. And I would sit there, listening to him curse my own singular brilliance. It was a macabre, fascinating spectacle. I was the ghost destroying his entire world, and he was sleeping right beside me every night, oblivious to the bomb under his pillow. Then came the final, devastating, unforgivable act of public cruelty, the Imperial Gala. Their last, desperate chance to save face and secure a lifeline. Mrs. Thorne and Aunt Carol delivered the ultimatum with surgical malice. Daniel would attend with Vivian Chen, the rival's daughter, not because she was better connected, but because it was the ultimate, public, visible dismissal of me, the unfit wife, the final erasure. Mrs. Thorne had the audacity to call me into her study. "Elena, dear," she cooed, "we've decided it's best if you stay home. Daniel needs to project an image of strength and stability. Vivian understands the Thorne level of networking. We'll simply say you have a migraine." I stood there, looking at the two of them, and felt a profound, exhilarating clarity. They were not just asking me to stay home, they were publicly annulling my very identity, throwing me onto the social scrap heap. And Daniel, when I looked him directly in the eyes and asked if he agreed, he avoided my gaze, shuffled his feet, and confirmed with a weak nod that it's just business. "Elena, please understand, is it?" I asked him, my voice a whisper of pure, impending frost, "or is it just another way to dismiss the woman you chose, the woman whose mind, whose heart, and whose existence you never bothered to respect?" He couldn't answer. He had chosen, definitively and finally, his lineage over his wife. I smiled then, a genuine, powerful, and terrifying smile that wiped the smugness right off their collective faces. "Very well. If Daniel attends the Imperial Gala with Ms. Chen, then I shall attend. As myself, I have my own invitation." Aunt Carol laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that quickly dissolved into stunned silence. "You? Who would invite you, Elena? The catering staff?" "The invitation is already waiting," I told her, my eyes locked on Daniel's pale, passive face. "The invitation is always waiting." That night, preparing my custom, ungodly expensive gown and fastening the Aegis-funded diamond necklace, a breathtaking reflection of my singular power, it wasn't about looking beautiful. It was about preparing the battlefield for the final, necessary sacrifice. I was ready to claim my throne and execute my justice. When I walked into that gala, the sheer change in atmosphere was instantaneous and overwhelming. I felt the absolute shift in energy on my skin, the collective, audible gasp from the assembled elites, the sudden, sharp focus of 1,000 pairs of eyes. I was on the arm of Mr. Chen, the CEO of the Imperial Group himself, the very man Daniel was so desperately trying to impress, the man who was about to give a keynote speech praising my company, not his. I saw Daniel first. He was mid-conversation with Vivian Chen, and when he saw me, the polite facade instantly disintegrated, his face went pale, his jaw went slack, and in that agonizing moment of recognition, his entire world cracked, publicly, visibly. Then came the whispers. I heard Aunt Carol's voice, a raw, terrified shriek, "Who is that woman? She looks exactly like, impossible." Mrs. Thorne's denial was loud, desperate, and served only as the magnificent, echoing music to my victory. I allowed Mr. Chen to make his public toast, his voice ringing across the ballroom. He spoke eloquently of the true visionary of our time, the founder of Aegis Tech, the person whose disruptive technology was setting the pace for the entire region. He turned and raised his glass, not to Daniel, but directly to me. To Madam CEO Elena Thorne. A true partner to the imperial name. Pandemonium. The crowd erupted in genuine applause, but the Thorne corner was silent, frozen in a tableau of utter defeat. I saw the absolute, crushing realization dawn on Daniel's face, the recognition that the aggressive new tech firm, destroying his life, the company he cursed daily, was founded and run by the meek, ignored wife who slept beside him. It was a triumph of psychological, financial, and social warfare. The humiliation was total, visible, and utterly deserved. I let them simmer for 30 more minutes, accepting congratulations and securing 3 massive, headline-worthy deals right in front of Daniel. When I finally walked over to their corner, Mrs. Thorne and Aunt Carol looked like 2 statues carved from shame and raw desperation. "Elena. My dear daughter-in-law. You must help us." Mrs. Thorne's voice was broken, stripped bare of its cruel authority, a sound I had waited years to hear. "Please, Elena," Aunt Carol whimpered, "you're the only one who can save the company." I looked at Daniel. He was silent, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of shock, awe, and gut-wrenching, belated regret, the full, unbearable weight of his lifelong failure pressing down on him. "Daniel," I said, my voice low and steady, "why did you hide this from me?" He flinched, physically recoiling. I was under pressure. My mother, the company. I was protecting you. I wanted you to be safe from the stress. And I looked at him, and I finally delivered the truth that mattered, the final, surgical cut that ended our life together. I could have saved your company a dozen times, Daniel. But I couldn't save us. Because the man I fell in love with valued his mother's approval and his family's pride over my existence, my intelligence, and my heart. He valued his status over my respect. I didn't hide my power because I was afraid of the risk. I hid it because your family made me small, and you, my husband, let them. I didn't want to save a marriage built on my constant, relentless humiliation. I then presented him with the contract, the full acquisition of Thorne Corporation. I was buying his birthright, his identity, everything he had protected at my expense. "Sign this," I commanded. "I will save the company, your father's legacy, and the jobs of thousands. But the Thorne name will answer to Aegis Tech. You will report to me. You can work for me, as a director. Or you can walk away with nothing but your hollow pride. The choice is yours. Choose wisely, Daniel." He signed. Of course, he signed. His mother's legacy was everything to him, and he chose at one final time, signing the papers that made him my employee, and the papers that finalized the dissolution of our marriage, all within minutes. The immediate, sweet revenge was intoxicating, a sharp, cold elixir of finality. Mrs. Thorne and Aunt Carol were forced into immediate retirement, their massive stake in the company now answering directly to me. They had to ask my permission to manage their affairs, to host parties, to maintain the opulent life they had used to oppress me. Their pride was utterly, systematically destroyed. Daniel stayed. He works for me now, a competent, humbled executive, and sometimes, I catch him looking at me across the conference table, searching for the warmth and recognition that used to be there, but it's gone, replaced by the cold, clear light of absolute authority. I am the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire. I am respected, feared, and undeniably powerful. And yet, I am alone. The vengeance was worth the price, yes. It was necessary. It was the only viable path to self-preservation and justice. But the victory? The victory is mine alone, and sometimes, that is the coldest, loneliest place of all. I had to destroy the life I had to burn the past to the ground, to finally be the woman I was meant to be, the woman they refused to acknowledge. I am the secret CEO no more. My silence is over. But the woman who simply wanted a simple, honest partnership, she remains the final, unseen casualty of the necessary war I had to win.